Hi there. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whatever time it is. As always, happy whatever day it is that you're watching this, and welcome. I'm Larry Erickson. This is the Erickson Report. And we start this time with a correction. Last time, in discussing the increasing banning of books in schools, I said twice that PEN America's Index of School Book Bans listed 650 unique titles that had been banned from schools during the preceding school year. What I meant to say in each of those instances was 1,650 unique titles, not 650, 1,650. It's worth adding here that according to a recent CBS News poll, over 80% of Americans agree that books should not be banned for schools for discussing race, for criticizing U.S. history, including the history of slavery, or for holding political ideas they disagree with. The poll found wide agreement on this across Americans. It extended across party lines. Whites and blacks were pretty much the same, and in fact, the parents and the general public were also pretty much the same. So when you hear about all this and you try to have to deal with all this, maybe in your own locale, remember two things. One, this is yet again, this is all the work of a small, fractious, but extremely loud minority using hyperbolic language and manufactured outrage in defense of white supremacist refusal to admit the reality of racism and to protect bigotry against the rights and even the existence of LGBTQ+ youth. And two, underlying all this is the long-standing drive by the reactionary right to strip away a right to eliminate the very concept of a right to a public education and return education to a prerogative of the powerful, with the rest of us knowing just enough to fulfill our duties in our lowly place in the hierarchy. All right, next up, a follow-up to something that I've discussed before. Back in May, I addressed the killing of Palestinian-American journalist Shireen Abu Akleh, who was shot while she was covering an IDF, which is the Israeli Defense Forces, an IDF operation near the occupied West Bank city of Jenin. Now there's a new report. It's the result of a collaboration between the Palestinian civil rights group Al-Haq and the UK-based research agency called Forensic Architecture. And this report has concluded that Abu Akleh was deliberately and repeatedly targeted by Israeli snipers who shot her down despite, or perhaps even because of, the fact that she could be clearly identified as a member of the press. Now, this new report confirms the findings of a half-dozen other independent reviews of the incident, which has found that Israeli forces were responsible for Abu Akleh's killing, including one report from the United Nations that referred to the killing shot as well aimed. But this new report goes beyond those by having a detailed digital reconstruction of the shooting based on previously unseen like B-roll footage recorded by Al Jazeera staff on the scene at the time, open source video, eyewitness accounts, and a drone survey of the area, and so offers the most comprehensive, detailed examination of what happened. Now, the Israeli response to this whole business from the very beginning has been both despicable and typical. The first immediate response, including from then Israeli Prime Minister Naftali Bennett, was to say that it had to be Palestinian militants. I mean, it just had to be. Who else could it be? The IDF Chief of Staff, Major General Aviv Kochavi, said that Palestinians shoot, quoting, wildly and indiscriminately in every direction, while IDF soldiers, quoting again, carry out professional and selective firing. So, of course, it had to be the Palestinians. The Israeli Ministry of Defense then produced a video it claimed showed what it called Palestinian terrorists who likely killed Abu Akleh, only to have it turn out that the video was shot several hundred yards away in the wrong direction, and there was neither any shooting nor any militants anywhere around where Akleh was. Right around that same time, the Israeli military declared, quoting, there was no need to open a military police investigation because, in effect, said, there was a lot of shooting and stuff going on, so, who really knows what happened? But Israeli did promise to make a full investigation of this. And on September 5th, it released its official review. This review actually admitted that Abu Akleh was probably killed by IDF forces, but hey, it was accidental. It's like, it doesn't count. These things happen, get over it. Which, by the way, is, so much for Major General Kushavi's professional and selective firing, as that statement is now either a lie or what happened was a deliberate murder. And reconstruction in this new report gives every reason to think it was the latter. The reconstruction clearly shows that, again, there were neither armed gunmen nor shots fired in the minutes leading up to Abu Akleh's killing. And during the incident itself, only shots fired were fired from an IDF position. Moreover, the reconstruction shows that Abu Akleh's and her colleagues' press insignias were clearly visible from the position of the IDF shooter, that the shooter had a clear line of fire, that the pattern of shots indicated a precise aim, and that the firing continued as the journalist sought shelter. After Abu Akleh was hit, in fact, a civilian attempting to provide her aid to drag her out of the line of fire was repeatedly fired on. So what's happened is that multiple early reports came to a similar conclusion. They said that Shireen Abu Akleh, and by the way, in case you didn't catch it, she was a Palestinian-American journalist. She was an American citizen. That Shireen Abu Akleh was deliberately targeted by the Israeli military. And this new report, with the strongest proof yet, renders the same judgment as the rest. Sadly, also like the rest, I expect it won't make a damn bit of difference. There have been calls both in and out of Congress now for the U.S. to make its own investigation of what is at the least an extrajudicial killing of one of its citizens, and all these appeals have had no effect. U.S. officials claim that they have reviewed the findings of Israeli and Palestinian investigators, but they failed to reach a definitive conclusion. As Secretary of State Anthony Blinken wistfully says he wishes someone could do an independent investigation. Deliberately ignoring the string of such independent investigations, human rights organizations indeed have reached a conclusion, along with the fact the U.S. could do its own such independent investigation if it chose to do so, deterred only by the fearful knowledge of what it would be forced to admit if it actually did that. And so it goes, without consequences. As the U.S. continues to finance Israel's military to the tune of $3.8 billion a year, every year, as our policy wobbles between evading responsibility for and making excuses for the crimes against human rights that our aid helps enable. And at the same time, this also helps to perpetuate a political atmosphere where Israel, whatever its policies, whatever its behavior, whatever its crimes, is essentially exempt from criticism, and where speaking the most literal and simple truth, even if carefully expressed, can and quite possibly will lead to charges of being an anti-Semite. Consider that there's a movement known as BDS. It stands for Boycott, Divest, and Sanction. Its aim is to bring economic and cultural pressure on Israel to change its policies with regard to the Palestinians, particularly with regard to those in the occupied territories, but also regarding Palestinian citizens of Israel. And the very fact that it is called for these sort of actions, that very fact itself, has resulted in its being labeled anti-Semitic. Indeed, there are so-called anti-BDS laws in 35 states that in some ways seek to constrict speech by economically penalizing through loss of government investment or contracts any company that might consider joining the boycott. Consider too, the recent example of Representative Rashida Tlaib. Speaking at a Palestine Advocacy Day event on September 20th, she said, this is an exact quote, "I want you all to know that among progressives, it becomes clear that you cannot claim to hold progressive values, yet back Israel's apartheid government." It took precisely one day for Jonathan Greenblatt, the CEO of the Anti-Defamation League, to twist Tlaib's words into her making a declaration that progressive American Jews must pass an anti-Zionist litmus test, and that she doubles down on her anti-Semitism, he said, an anti-Semitism consisting of slandering Israel as an apartheid state. The same day, Representative Jerry Nadler said, quoting again, "I fundamentally reject the notion that one cannot support Israel's right to exist as a Jewish state and democratic state and be a progressive," which is even further removed from what Tlaib actually said than even Greenblatt was. Other members of Congress, including Representative Ted Deutsch, Haley Stevens, Debbie Wasserman Schultz, Juan Vargas, and others, made similar conflicts, all conflating being against, quote, Israel's apartheid government with rejecting Israel's right to exist altogether and declaring that calling Israel an apartheid state is by definition both slander and anti-Semitic. Major media outlets, including CNN, picked up on and amplified the message. Criticize Israel and you'll be labeled anti-Semitic. Now, beyond the fact that Tlaib said nothing about Israel's right to exist, only to its governing policies, the brutal truth is that Israel is an apartheid state. It has been found to be one by Human Rights Watch, by B'Tselem, which is an Israeli-based civil rights, human rights group, by Amnesty International, and by United Nations human rights agencies. Now, for clarity, so we know what we're talking about here, Amnesty International says, and I'm going to quote this in full, "The crime against humanity of apartheid under the Apartheid Convention, the Rome Statute, and customary international law is committed when any inhuman or inhumane act, essentially a serious human rights violation, is perpetrated in the context of an institutionalized regime of systematic oppression and domination by one racial group over another with the intention to maintain that system. Apartheid can best be understood as a system of prolonged and cruel discriminatory treatment by one racial group of members of another with the intention to control the second racial group." That is apartheid. And that is what leading human rights groups have repeatedly said Israel is guilty of. And it won't change. It won't change until there are consequences. Palestinians in the occupied territories will continue to see discrimination, continue to see their homes demolished, their land seized, their human rights denied, and unless and until there are consequences. And they will continue to be killed without recourse. And that also applies to journalists, bringing us around full circle to where we were, because Abu Akleh was not the first. There have been at least 45 journalists killed by the professional and selective firing of IDF since 2000. Now, those consequences that I'm talking about, they should include a declaration by the U.S. that it will no longer use its veto in the Security Council or its influence in the General Assembly to shield or protect Israel against any UN sanctions, and that the Department of Justice takes the position that it will pursue in court that all the anti-BDS laws are unconstitutional violations of the rights to free speech and free political association, and most importantly, there will be no more military aid to or military cooperation with, and no more security guarantees to Israel until there is a final and just settlement to guarantee Palestinian rights, including the right to statehood. Those are the consequences that the U.S. should impose to end the injustice and the occupation and the apartheid. But I have to admit at this moment, in all truth, that I have no faith that this will happen, at least not until the current generations, including my own, die off. Let's take a break. And we're back. And we're back with, guess what? It's Social Security is going bankrupt season again. At least every couple of years, we experience a spate of articles about how Social Security is on the verge of some sort of catastrophe. It's running out of money, or it will in a few years. It's unsustainable. Huge benefit cuts are just around the corner. We have to do something. Oh my God, oh my God, oh my God. And it's always the same old arguments and the same old predictions and the same old false comparisons. I've been having these arguments for over 10 years with people, and I'm reminded that several years ago, someone said that debating certain climate change denialists was like debating a well-trained parrot that had memorized about a dozen phrases that it could just spew out at random. It's pretty much the same here, except there's even less variety in the arguments. One latest example comes from one John Chizar, and I'm probably seriously mangling the pronunciation of his name. I apologize by that. But he's the financial planner writing on the 10 biggest problems facing Social Security. Now, several of the problems, frankly, are temporary things based on conditions of the moment, for example, low interest rates. Those that aren't temporary things are the same old things that sound drastic but really mean little or nothing. But it's worth going through some of these because you should arm yourself against them, because if you ever get into an argument about this, these will come up. All right, one is that life expectancy is rising. Actually, it hasn't these past few years, but let's hope that that's a temporary phenomenon. But one is that life expectancy is rising, and so there are longer retirements and therefore a bigger drain on the system, and oh dear, how will we ever afford that? Except that greater life expectancy has also led to people working longer and even putting off retirement voluntarily, not out of economic necessity. And many retirees do work part-time. I do. For example, again, not always by need, you don't always need the income. And so those people, they continue to contribute something to the system, even after they've reached retirement age, and may even, if they earn more than a certain amount, find that some of their benefits are actually taxed back, as some of mine are. But a really deceptive argument is the too many beneficiaries due to the baby boomer bulge argument. The thing is, though, the demographic bulge is very real, but it was seen coming. You could see it coming. You knew what happened. Everybody knew what happened. And so some years back, and I forget just when, it was the early 80s, I forget just when though, but the tax rate for Social Security was increased specifically to create a surplus that could be tapped on when those baby boomers started retiring. In effect, baby boomers started pre-financed their retirement benefits. So the point is that when you hear about Social Security account going to zero in 2034, and well, Chizar, I assume using the latest data says it's actually 2041, but whenever, it's that surplus that will have been spent. That surplus was deliberately created to deal with this. And it's a surplus that will have been spent down, returning Social Security to the pay-as-you-go system it's been on for most of its existence, which is now over 80 years. And here, let me address something subtle, okay? To talk about looming massive benefit cuts that are always a part of these discussions. Okay, your Social Security benefits are calculated on a number of your highest earning years. For most people, as they approach retirement age, assuming you've been getting increases over the course, pay raises over the course of your working life. The thing is, when you hear about these benefit cuts, they are from projected benefits. The thing is, over time, wages tend to rise a little faster than inflation, which in turn means that over time, initial benefits for new retirees measured in real terms, that is after accounting for inflation, it's an actual measure of how much stuff you can actually buy. New retirees over time provide a gradually increasing standard of living for those new retirees compared to the ones before them. What this means is that by the time these benefits come, the result of that cut in projected benefits could actually mean that new retirees have the same standard of living, can buy as much stuff as those retiring now can. Now, that's not something to be welcomed, obviously, but it is even further from the disaster it's intended to be. Just remember, those cuts, you're supposed to think they're from the current level of benefits. Everybody's getting 25% less than they get now, when it's actually 25 or whatever the percentage is, less than it's projected to be at some point in the future. Anyway, getting back to the arguments. Another deceptive one is the not enough workers claim. This is that the worker to retiree ratio is shrinking. 60 years ago, we're told there were 5 workers for every person receiving Social Security. More recently, it went down to 2.8 workers per beneficiary. Now it's, gasp, 2.1. How can we ever possibly afford this? Now, it sounds dreadful, except for the fact that that figure itself is useless. Workers don't just support retired people, they support all non-workers, including their children, including their spouses if they don't work, maybe including other people they know. Even as the number of retirees is growing, family size is shrinking. So over those decades that are coming, even as the ratio of workers to retirees is expected to go down, the ratio of workers to non-workers is going up. More workers for every non-worker. 60 years ago, again, there were 1.05 workers for every non-worker. By 2030, demographic trends say it'll be 1.27 workers for every non-worker. So actually, using the logic that's claimed for this very argument, in the future we'll be able to better afford Social Security than we can now. The burden on workers, that is, will be much the same. It's just that, in effect, a portion of that burden will be shifted from supporting their children to supporting their parents. But then, of course, the real issue is congressional stalemate, the refusal of those politicians to do what's needed to fix this. Now, it is true, there has not been any significant Social Security legislation since the 1980s, but a good part of the reason for that is that the only solutions usually offered, and the only ones offered in this article, are ones that just dump the burden on workers, raise the retirement age, which in fact has already been done, cut benefits, raise the payroll tax. All right, you want to know how to protect Social Security for the next 75 years, which is as far out into the future as the economic projections as the governing board of the Social Security system projects? And you can do it without harming the benefits of workers and ordinary and middle class and poor people. Remove the cap on the Social Security wage base. Right now, any earned income you get that's over $142,800 a year is not subject to payroll tax. So someone making, say, $1.4 million a year pays the same Social Security taxes as somebody making 1/10 of that much. Now, such a move, removing the cap, would only affect the richest 8% of Americans, which is why, of course, it hasn't been done. But I'd go even beyond that. Remember, that tax applies to earned income. So-called unearned income, income from passive sources such as dividends, interest, pensions, or a business in which you have no active role, those are not subject to payroll taxes. Well, frankly, as far as I'm concerned, money is fungible. And if you can spend it the same way, it can be taxed the same way, which again would primarily affect the richest among us, which again is why it's not even on the table. Bottom line, an appropriate expression here, Social Security may need some tweaks and fiddles, and it has been tweaked and fiddled with over the course of its history a number of times, but it's not going bankrupt. It's not about to collapse. It's not in need of major surgery, and for all you young folks, yes, it will be there for you when the time comes, so long as we, you and we, do not let the economic elites screw us over with fear-mongering and lies. All right, in these last couple of minutes, I have two quick notes on two issues that I am not going to try to discuss in any detail, and you'll see why. One of these is Iran. Events simply change too quickly, okay? There's no way a show that's on once every 2 weeks can possibly deal with current events in a situation like Iran. Anything I say here would be obsolete before you even heard it. But what I want to do is take a moment to express my profound respect and admiration for the massive crowds whose nonviolent protests have shaken the grounds of Iranian society and even government. They have braved beatings and bullets, over 150 killed so far, hundreds more injured, thousands arrested. And while they may not achieve their goals of a more open society in the face of the willingness of the Ayatollahs to unleash even greater violence against them, they still stand as evidence that, in time, Iran will change. As put by Khazra Arabi, he's the program lead at the Tony Blair Institute for Global Change, unrestrained violence, I'm quoting here, unrestrained violence against unarmed civilians may quash the protests this time around. But the mood on the streets, it said, is explicitly revolutionary. They don't want reform, they want regime change. Of course, no one can predict when this moment will happen. It could be weeks, months, or even years. But the Iranian people have made up their mind. Iran will change. The other thing I'm not going to discuss, for the same reason, events changing too rapidly, is Ukraine. But I do want to make one observation here. There's been much discussion about the danger of Russia, that is Vladimir Putin, the danger of him escalating to nuclear weapons if things continue to go badly. But there's another danger that should also be considered, should also be addressed. And that one's coming from Ukraine, specifically from Volodymyr Zelensky. He specifically barred any negotiations to end the war so long as Putin, or as I call him, Pukin, remains in power. Just as I said before the war started, given nations unfortunate historical preference for war over humiliation, if you don't want a war, you have to give the other side a way to back out without appearing to back down. The same applies to ending a war. Now, I'm sure, frankly, Zelensky is envisioning a coup overthrowing Putin, led by a group eager to offer Ukraine any number of concessions up to and including forswearing any claims on Crimea. But I wonder if he's actually giving full consideration to the increased risk to which he is subjecting his people with an uncompromising attitude, and the question of what there is still to be gained that is worth the cost that it will require. The American pacifist A.J. Muste once said, "The problem with war isn't the loser, but the winner. Who will teach them that might doesn't make right?" Now that things appear to be going his way, that's a question that Volodymyr Zelensky should be asking himself. All right, that's it. I'm going to stop there. Hope you've enjoyed that. Again, any comments are always welcome. Whoviating at AOL.com, and I'll see you in 2 weeks. In the meantime, have the best 2 weeks you possibly can. And peace.